Hello and welcome back everyone, I'm Brandon, this is Born to Rant, and today we are here to talk about one of the last great old school swashbucklers. A movie that focused its budget on real sets, stunts, and choreography. That's right, today we are covering how the Mask of Zorro came to be, everything that makes it awesome, and its legacy almost 30 years later. This is actually one of the first movies I've covered on the channel where I remember exactly where I was the first time I saw it. It was New Year's Eve going from 1998 into 1999, and my mom, stepdad, and siblings rented a couple of movies to watch together. We rented The Parent Trap and The Mask of Zorro, and you know what? I thought both movies slapped, and I still do. Anyway, by the time I saw the movie, I was actually already really into Zorro. For some reason, I had episodes of the TV show from 1957 on VHS, and I watched those repeatedly. Man, I haven't revisited that show in years. After watching The Mask of Zorro, I was fully obsessed. Because as a kid, I was equally obsessed with superhero stuff and swashbuckling stuff. Shocking, right? A kid in the 90s who wanted to be in an action movie? I'm sure this is a completely unique experience to me, right? But seriously, this was a movie that completely captured my imagination as a kid. It had everything I wanted from this kind of movie. Big, explosive action, comedy, romance, and it even has a couple of genuinely creepy moments. But before I get too deep into talking about why The Mask of Zorro deserves its place in the Summer Blockbuster Hall of Fame, let's go back in time and learn a little bit more about how the character and this movie came to be. The character of Zorro, which is the Spanish word for fox, was created in 1919 by Johnston McCauley and made his first appearance in the pages of pulp magazine All Story Weekly. And just 1 year later, Zorro would appear in his first movie, The Mark of Zorro, which would kickstart a long history of adaptations of the character. But after 1981's disappointing Zorro the Gay Blade, the hype around Zorro really began to die down. And it wasn't until the early 90s that Zorro's rights holders would sell the film rights to Columbia Pictures, who would be teaming up with Steven Spielberg and Amblin Entertainment to produce the next Zorro movie. And then from 1991 to 1997, The Mask of Zorro entered what we like to call development hell, where it cycled through numerous writers and directors. There are actually 4 credited writers on this movie, but Randall Johnston was the first writer brought on board, and he came up with the idea of having an older and younger Zorro featured. Plus, he and Spielberg were also very responsible for all of these somewhat historically accurate references in the movie. But the one I'd like to call out is the inclusion of real-life Robin Hood-like outlaw Joaquin Murrieta, who was a big inspiration on Johnston McCauley as he created the character of Zorro. I just wanted to shout this out because I actually didn't know any of this prior to doing research for this video, and I just found it super interesting. But anyway, back to the screenplay. Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio also took a pass on the script, and these two are mostly known for their work on Aladdin, Shrek, and the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And finally, John Escow was brought on board to provide some finishing touches and get the script to a place where both the studio and the stars were happy. And of course, The Mask of Zorro also shuffled through a ton of different directors. Originally, Steven Spielberg was going to direct. He dropped out, and then it went to Robert Rodriguez, who was fired because the movie he wanted to make was too violent for Columbia Pictures. And finally, they brought on Martin Campbell, who had just completely reinvented and revitalized the James Bond franchise with GoldenEye. And actually, Campbell would go on to do the same thing again a decade later with Casino Royale. And Campbell brought his cinematographer from GoldenEye, Philip Mayhew, on board, and damn, these two just know how to make action look good, don't they? As for the casting of The Mask of Zorro, for the role of Don Diego de la Vega, the studio originally reached out to Sir Sean Connery, who passed. They also reached out to Raul Julia, who unfortunately passed away before he could accept the role. And finally, the role of Don Diego de la Vega went to Sir Anthony Hopkins, who accepted after a life-changing back surgery made him feel like he would have a blast in this role. Antonio Banderas was brought on board to star as Alejandro Murrieta off the strength of his work with Robert Rodriguez on 1995's Desperado. And my favorite fun fact about Banderas and this movie is that the swordmaster who worked on this movie, Bob Anderson, whose history in Hollywood stretches from the days of Errol Flynn all the way to the Lord of the Rings Rings trilogy and beyond. Anyway, I say all of this because Bob Anderson said that Antonio Banderas was hands down the most naturally talented swordsman he'd ever worked with, which is pretty dope, and for me at least makes the way that Alejandro instantly becomes a master swordsman just a little more believable. Does it actually matter? No, but I think it's cool. And rounding out our three main protagonists, Catherine Zeta-Jones was cast as Elena at the suggestion of Steven Spielberg, who had seen and loved her in a recent BBC miniseries on the Titanic. And let's just talk about the fact that Catherine Zeta-Jones is from Wales. But because of her role in this movie, I spent like 20 plus years thinking she was Latin in some way or another. But both she and Anthony Hopkins are fully Welsh. And if that bothers you, I completely understand. However, if we're looking at just the performances in this movie, everyone here is pretty perfect in their respective roles. There is only one person on this planet that I think could have done a better job in the role of Elena than Catherine Zeta-Jones, and that is Sofia Vergara, who in my opinion would have instantly become like the biggest movie star in the world if she ended up in this movie. And it's not like she was even up for this role, I just think she would have been amazing in this movie. And in January of 1997, The Mask of Zorro began production, filming entirely in Mexico, with most of the production taking place at Estudios Churubusco in Mexico City. And the production of this movie faced a lot of the same problems that a lot of big movies like this face. People got sick, props were delayed arriving to set because of customs, and their big explosion in the finale was messed up not once, but twice. Basically, the first time they tried to blow the mine, they didn't use enough explosives. The next time they used way too much, but only half of it blew. So the third time they finally got it right, and you can actually see all three explosions in the movie. And finally, on July 17th, 1998, The Mask of Zorro was released into the world, and it was a giant hit right away. It received mostly positive reviews from most of the major critics, and audiences loved The Mask of Zorro too. On its opening weekend, it earned $22.5 million against its $95 million budget. And what's funny is that now that would be considered a massive disappointment. But in 1998, movies would play for months and months on end, so all told, at the end of its theatrical run, The Mask of Zorro made a worldwide total of $250 million, making this movie easily profitable before it even hit the home video market. And with all of that out of the way, I think it's time to dive in and talk about everything that makes The Mask of Zorro awesome. So one of the things I love most about this movie is that it announces how awesome it's going to be right away, with Banderas stepping out into a black void in full Zorro costume and cutting a Z into the screen. Obviously, it's a little nod to James Bond, but I think this movie kind of makes it its own. I mean, the Z even catches on fire. That's way cooler than the blood they use in James Bond. And even this little opening tease aside, the first proper shot of the movie is just on another level when it comes to setting things up. We see a kid carve two eye holes into a tent to look through, and it looks like he's wearing a Mask of Zorro. I just think it's a really, really clever shot to start the movie with. And the prologue of this movie is just pure swashbuckling brilliance from start to finish. First of all, how awesome is it when we're introduced to our main villain, he's just casually doing a bump of just in case we were confused about who the bad guy would be in this PG-13 movie, his introduction is him doing drugs, which is just brilliant 90s Dare era filmmaking. But this entire prologue is incredible from a screenwriting perspective, from a filmmaking perspective, and from a stunt work perspective. We meet all of our main characters and set up their relationships immediately. We know that Don Rafael Montero, played by Stuart Wilson, is being forced to leave California, and he hates Zorro. We meet Joaquin Murrieta and his brother Alejandro, who save Zorro and are given his medallion. We learn that Zorro is actually Don Diego de la Vega, and then we watch as Rafael comes to his hacienda to arrest him, leading to the death of Don Diego's wife and the mother of his child. So Rafael's a real piece of shit and sends Don Diego to prison and steals his daughter as his own. And all of this happens in the first 18 minutes of the movie. The 18-minute mark is quite literally the cut to 20 years later, where we meet adult Alejandro and Joaquin and their buddy Three Finger Jack. And it's kind of made very clear up front that Joaquin, not Alejandro, is the leader of their little gang. He's the one wearing the medallion they received from Zorro. And this whole little prisoner exchange fake out is just awesome, and I've always loved the way that Joaquin says, "That's because you're stupid." It's just a perfect little zinger, and again, kind of shows us that maybe Joaquin was more of the natural choice choice to become Zorro. But as our heroes are about to escape with their loot, our secondary antagonist, Captain Harrison Love, played by Matt Lesher, who I primarily know from playing Eobard Thawne on the Flash TV show. So anyway, Captain Love shows up with a group of men who quickly take out Three Finger Jack and surround Joaquin as Alejandro gets away. And I've just always kind of thought it was badass that Joaquin doesn't give the soldiers the satisfaction of killing him. A true rebel. And this sequence is what pushes Alejandro to become Zorro. His desire to get revenge on Captain Love for taking his brother from him. But then we cut to see Don Rafael returning to the shores of California and going to the prison where he left Don Diego just to see if he's still alive. But our boy is too smart for that and just hangs back and lets these prisoners yell out like they're in Spartacus. And Don Diego's escape from prison is very clearly modeled after the prison break from Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, which would be remade just a few years later in 2002, and because of that, I always confuse the prison break in these two movies. But this prison break scene rocks, and so does the one in Count of Monte Cristo. I'm gonna have to talk about that movie soon. It's really great. The next morning, Don Rafael makes his official return to California, where he immediately sells out his fellow Dons and tries to get the crowd of Mexicans who hate him to trust him and believe him when he says they're going to take control of California away from Mexico, Spain, and/or the United States and be their very own country of California. While Don Rafael is speaking, we get these great shots of Don Diego moving through the crowd, keeping an eye on him and ready to kill him as soon as he has the chance. But then he sees Elena come onto the screen and realizes he needs to completely alter his plans, which leads Don Diego to a fateful encounter with Alejandro where, after a brief disagreement, the two agree to team up and handle their revenge against Don Rafael and Captain Love together. And I know training sequences are kind of hacked these days. At this point, we've kind of seen every single way a training montage can be shot and presented to us, but the training montage in The Mask of Zorro kicks ass. I especially love the idea of the training circle and how it foreshadows Alejandro's final duel with Captain Love, but more on that in just a bit. After the training montage, Alejandro decides to go out as what I'm going to call Diet Zorro, to steal a horse for himself, and here he finally meets Elena and sparks fly immediately between these two. And I love their interaction in the confessional with Elena confessing that she's already had impure thoughts about Zorro, and the entire action sequence of Alejandro escaping is so much fun. It's just good old-fashioned swashbuckling filmmaking, from the bad guys piling on Alejandro and him slithering out to this moment with Alejandro lighting the cannon, which always makes me think of Bugs Bunny. So once Alejandro returns to Don Diego, he's scolded for a moment for going out as Zorro before he was ready. But then the two make a plan to join high society and infiltrate Don Rafael's inner circle. Also, Anthony Hopkins just casually whipping candles wasn't in the script. He just got so good with a whip they decided to throw it in. The next night, our two heroes enact their plan and infiltrate Don Rafael's party and quickly his inner circle as well. I like that Alejandro kind of steps all over his words a few times while talking to Don Rafael, but he's so smooth and cool he's able to recover every single time. But the main reason to talk about this party sequence has nothing to do with the plot of the movie. That all becomes secondary to what is maybe the hottest dance scene ever featured in a major blockbuster. The dance sequence between Alejandro and Elena honestly reminds me of movies from the 30s and 40s where sex wasn't allowed in movies, so you had to find other ways to get your characters to have erotic moments with one another. And just this dance sequence rocks so hard, I could watch it on a loop, and the way that Antonio Banderas has to sell that Alejandro is almost offended by Elena's dancing is just excellent. Like, you watch him go from being fully in the moment to snapping back to reality and having to come up with some sort of excuse for what just happened. So, like a jerk, he blames Elena. The next morning, Alejandro is taken to the mine that Don Rafael and Captain Love have secretly been running for months using slave labor. And their plan is to use the gold they're mining on Santa Anna's land to buy California from Santa Anna himself, who needs money to prepare for war. And the mine really sets up the rest of the movie. We get the bad guys' plans, we know what our hero needs to do to save the day, and it sets up that Captain Love pretty much has it figured out that the man claiming to be Don Alejandro is not all that he appears. In fact, after Alejandro was clearly shaken by the death of Three Finger Jack, he's pretty convinced that Alejandro is Joaquin Murrieta's brother. Captain Love even shows Alejandro Joaquin's head in a jar. See, I told you there was some creepy stuff in this movie. And seriously, Alejandro drinking from this jar made me actually want to gag when I watched this. And stuff like that just doesn't usually get to me, but something about this just really got under my skin. That following night, Zorro makes his real triumphant return, and this entire action sequence at Don Rafael's hacienda is yet another highlight of this movie. And it's a long action sequence, lasting almost a full 15 minutes from the time we see the burning Z to the time Alejandro arrives back at the hideout. Obviously, the two highlights from the sequence are the sword fight between Zorro and Elena, which again is one of the hottest things ever put on screen. Like, they're not even trying to kill each other, they're trying to cut each other's clothes off. Not quite as great as the dance sequence, but equally as hot. And the other standout moment is the horse chase at the end of the sequence, which features some of the most absolutely insane horse riding stunt work I have ever seen. Shout out to Tad Griffith, who performed a lot of these stunts. Once Alejandro meets back up with Don Diego, the two have a disagreement about what to do next. Alejandro wants to save the people at the mine, you know, like Zorro would do. But Don Diego only cares about his revenge and telling Elena the truth about who he is to her. And I think this is a really interesting point to end up in the third act, where Alejandro is now more concerned with saving people than his revenge, and Don Diego is now consumed with revenge, and Don Diego breaking into Rafael's hacienda is just excellent. The look in Hopkins' eyes is so determined and satisfied. It's just excellent acting. He's finally got Rafael where he wants him, and we see it written all over his face. And all of this leads us to our big final set piece, the mine. The mine is hands down one of the coolest third act set pieces from this era of filmmaking, and probably the last time we'll ever see a third act set piece like this that features no CGI. I mean, even Zorro catching the sun with his blade right here was done in camera in only 3 takes. This was old school Hollywood filmmaking to a T. The fight between Don Diego and Don Rafael is definitely the less interesting fight of the two, but it's still really well done. Both Hopkins and Wilson were in their 60s and 50s respectively while filming this movie, but they both go hard for this sequence. This was real physical acting, and I like that it's not a one-sided fight. They both take control over the fight multiple times. My biggest complaint about their fight is that Don Diego robs Elena of her own agency. Towards the end of the fight, she's looking at the people trapped in the cages and clearly is thinking about helping them, but it's not until Don Diego yells out to her to do it that she takes action. I just think it would have been 100 times more impactful if she just was like, you two are being ridiculous, I'm gonna go save these people now. Just something that really jumped out while I was watching this movie this time. And the final duel between Zorro and Captain Love is just thrilling from start to finish. But like I said earlier, the thing that makes this fight so special is the fact that it was foreshadowed so perfectly with Hopkins explaining the training circle. As their fight advances, the world around them begins to shrink until finally they're fighting on a small platform suspended in the air. And it's because of Alejandro's training in the circle that he can finally get the upper hand on Captain Love. And let's just say it, the deaths of both Don Rafael and Captain Love are two of the most satisfying deaths in movie history. It's the gold bars essentially killing them both that really does it for me. And just shout out to this movie for the bad guys being rich people wanting to screw over poor people, aka the most realistic villains a movie can have. The movie does conclude with the sad death of Don Diego, but before he dies, he gives Elena and Alejandro his blessing to be together. And the final scene of this movie is honestly kind of a perfect wraparound to the beginning, with Don Diego coming home and regaling Elena with stories of being Zorro as she laid in her crib. Alejandro and Elena share one final passionate kiss, and then Alejandro walks into the sunset. Seriously, how could anyone not love this movie? So almost 30 years later, what is the legacy of the Mask of Zorro? Honestly, I think its main legacy is the fact that it was sort of the last of its kind. The swashbuckler genre was already on its way out after 1995's Cutthroat Island was a massive bomb in theaters, but really it's the craft found in the Mask of Zorro that makes this movie special. You can tell that every part of this movie was put together with love and respect for the source material and the craft of filmmaking. The legacy of the Mask of Zorro is that it feels real because it was all real. These were real sets, real people, real stunts, real explosions. The things that now are all done inside of a computer. And that is no knock against CGI artists. And let's just give another shout out to cinematographer Phil Mayhew, who knocks it out of the park. This movie obviously isn't a traditional Western, but as far as how it looks, I think this movie could go toe to toe with any Sergio Leone Western. And there was a sequel released to this movie in 2005 called The Legend of Zorro, but it was not received nearly as well as Mask of Zorro. I've actually never seen Legend because when it came out, it didn't get very good reviews. So I've just kind of spent the last 20 years completely avoiding it, but I don't know, if you all wanted me to give it a watch and make a video on it, I think I'd be down. Just let me know in the comments. And at one point, Quentin Tarantino was wanting to do a sequel to Django Unchained that saw Jamie Foxx's Django meeting up with Banderas' Zorro, but this was canceled back back in 2019. And since Legend of Zorro, we really haven't had much in the way of Zorro adaptations. A couple of TV shows, one in Spain, another in France. So let me know in the comments, do you want to see more Zorro? Where would you want to see Zorro pop up next? If you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. I'm Brandon, and this has been Born to Rant. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And just a reminder, Born to Rant is a completely independent channel, and I use absolutely no AI in the making of my videos. We release new videos covering all of your childhood favorites every Thursday at 7 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.